Fraction estimation. When we work with fractions, sometimes it's easier to use estimation in order to get an answer that's close to the right answer. This is especially useful in maybe when you're doing a project at home where you need some materials to work with and you want to estimate how much you're going to need, just for an example. But for this one, the first step when we're working with fraction estimation is rounding. We're going to need to know how to round fractions. So rounding. Now there's a couple things to think about here. When we just have a simple fraction like 1/8, we're going to compare the numerator, which is the top number, the numerator. We're going to compare that with the denominator. Denominator. Okay, we're going to compare those two. Now in this case, 1/8. Well, 1 is a lot smaller than an 8. In fact, 1's closer to 0 than it is to an 8. So we would round 1/8 to 0. And I'm using the two squiggly lines, and because it's not equal to 0, it's approximately. When you round, you can use the two squiggly equal sign to indicate that it's not equal. You're just saying 0 is close enough to 1/8. Okay, another example. And typically, when you're working with fractions, you're going to round to the nearest 1/2. So an example of one where you would round to 1/2 could be something like 5/9. If you have 5/9. Okay, now half of 9, remember we're comparing the numerator and the denominator. Half of 9 is actually 4.5. And 5 is close to that. So we're going to say 5/9 is approximately 1/2. So we're going to round 5/9 to 1/2. Okay, now one more example of just a basic fraction and rounding could be, let's say, 6/7. Now 6 is almost as great as 7. It's really close to 7. So we're going to round 6/7 to 1. Okay, so that's the first step. Now, if it's just a regular ordinary fraction, this is how we're going to round. If it's a mixed number, meaning there's a whole number and a fraction put together, let's say 4 1/3. Okay, a mixed number, typically we round mixed numbers to the closest whole number. So round mixed numbers to the nearest whole number. This isn't always the case. Sometimes you want to make sure that you round high in real life situations, depending on what you're rounding. Especially if you're, let's say you're building something and you want to make sure you have enough materials. You want to make sure that you round high so that you'll have a little bit extra. But in this case, typically in your homework or in your math problems, when you have a mixed number, you'll round to the nearest whole number. So in this case, 4 1/3. Well, 1/3 is closer to 0 than it is to a whole. So we're just looking at the 1/3 here. It's closer to 0 than it is to a whole. So I'm going to round 4 1/3 down to 4. Okay, I'm rounding 4 1/3 down to 4. Now another problem could be let's say 5 3/4. Okay, we have the 5. Now the question is, what are we going to round it to? Well, look at the 3/4. Compare the numerator of that to the denominator. So 3 compared to a 4. Well, 3 is almost 4. So we can round that to a whole, and that would make this 5 plus 1, which would be 6. So we can round the 5 3/4 up to a 6. And typically, with a mixed number like this, if the fraction is greater than 1/2, you're going to round it up. If it's less than 1/2, you'll round it down. And that's kind of the rule we're going to follow for mixed numbers. So let's look at a difference problem. If we have subtraction. So let's look at 6 1/4. 6 1/4 minus 1 5/6. Okay, we're not actually going to solve the problem. We're going to use rounding, and then we're going to estimate what the answer is going to be. So 6 1/4. Look at the 1/4. The 1 is not very close to the 4. It's pretty small. So we can round the 6 1/4 down to a 6. And then we're going to subtract 1 5/6. Now 5 is really close to the 6 in this fraction. So we can round that up. So we're going to round the 1 5/6 up to a 2. So we'll get 6 minus 2, which is approximately 4. So 6 1/4 minus 1 5/6, we can estimate that it's about 4. Okay, now that's a difference problem. Let's look at when you add. Let's do a sum. So if you have 1/5 plus 7/8. Now remember, when we were working with mixed numbers, you round to the nearest whole. But when you're just looking at a fraction, you're going to round to the nearest half. And that could be 0, it could be a whole number, it could be a half. So you'll have to make that decision. In this example, 1/5. Now that one, you could go almost any way. You could say, well, that's close to 0. But depending on the problem, let's say, for example, you need some ribbon to make a project, and you know that you're going to need 1/5 of the yard of ribbon for something and 7/8 of a yard for something else. And you want to know how much ribbon do you need to get. Well, in this case, you would round the 1/5 to a half. Because you want to make sure you get at least 1/5. You're not going to say, well, 1/5 is close to 0, so I don't need any ribbon. Well, you do need 1/5 of a yard. So we'll round that to 1/2. And then the 7/8, we're going to round to a 1. So you're going to add 1/2 and 1. And you'll say, well, for this project, I'll need about 1.5 yards of ribbon. Okay, that's an example of a sum fraction that you would actually use in real life. So if you were making a costume or something and you needed 1/5 a yard for a costume and then 7/8 of a yard for another part of the costume, you would know that, well, I'm gonna get 1.5 yards just to be on the safe side.